Hello. The Divine Code for November 24th, pages 339 and 340. We are beginning the chapter, Deriving Benefit from Flesh Severed from a Living Animal, Cases with a Doubt, and Mixtures with Forbidden Meat. Topic number 1. Flesh severed from a living mammal or bird is forbidden to be eaten. However, if the flesh does become severed, one is permitted to derive benefit from it. A Gentile commits a capital sin only by specific violations of the Noahide commandments. Still, governments may decide whether or how violations of other aspects of the Noahide code, such as cruelty to animals, will be punished. So the Torah gives specific areas that might be punished by a court. And in these specific areas, it's always the death penalty in these areas where the Torah states that there's a liability. A government could come in and also give other things. You know, the government can come in and say, well, we're not going to allow deriving benefit from the flesh given by severed from a living animal. The government can say that, but the Torah does not give those commandments. The government would come in under the auspices of the requirement to establish courts of law to add extra penalties as seen fit by the government. Tractate Pesachim 22b and Maharil, chapter 161. From the biblical proof text, but flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat, prohibits eating, but does not mention deriving benefit. Therefore, it is permitted by Torah, it's permitted to use such meat for work or any type of benefit other than eating. So the Torah prohibition is specifically eating the flesh or eating the limb severed from a living animal. Topic number 2. Severed meat may thus be sold as non-food for profit. One may not, however, sell it to a person whom it is known will consume it, for that is considered as feeding him a prohibited substance, and Gentiles are forbidden to cause each other to transgress. And this was explained in earlier part of the Divine Code. So a limb severed from a living animal or flesh severed from a living animal can be sold on the marketplace if it's known that it's not going to be used for eating. Topic number 3. Torah prohibitions against eating involve eating a forbidden food in the ordinary manner and form. So eating refers to what would normally be considered eating. If meat has been processed and changed to the extent that it is no longer considered a food, there is no prohibition because it is no longer related in a normal way to eating. Therefore, if a piece of Aver Memakai meat has been changed to the extent that it is no longer in the category of human food, for example, if it was dried and made into a powder that itself would not be eaten in the manner of food, the prohibition is removed. Pre-Megillum, the Ordea 62, chapter 62, topics 1 and 4, it appears that even if one used this powder to make normal food, it is permitted as the original form is nullified. So logically, one might think that, well, the person is processing the food, turning it into something nobody in their right mind would eat, which is normal in the food industry. Food is taken from one state that's considered food. It's processed into something that, a powder or some other form, just regular gelatin, something like that, that people would not normally eat. It would not be considered food. Then, but it's done with the intention of then processing it into food. And I would have a question if it's intended, the person that turns it into the powder intends to then turn around and mix it into make it part of a food product. Would that powder in the intern be permitted or forbidden at that point? And or is it that the powder, if the intention is to create the powder, but it's not to make it into food, it's into doing something else with it, but then it was turned into food, it might be permitted. That needs to be dug into more deeply here. But the way it states clearly is that once it's made into the powder, once it's made into something that's not considered food, then it's been nullified. So if it's eaten while it's in the powder state, it would not be considered flesh from a living animal. And perhaps afterwards, if it's mixed back into food, it would no longer be considered flesh because it's changed its state. Topic number 4. When it is customary to eat the meat of a particular species of mammal or bird raw, the conditions on liability to punishment for eating meat removed from a living animal apply even if the meat is eaten raw. So a lot of this has to do with the customs in an area and whether or not a particular item is considered food in that area. Some areas they would never consider eating raw meat. Another area they consider it steak tartare, and it's a delicacy. So this is dependent on what's considered meat in the community that a person is in. When, however, it is not customary to eat meat of an animal raw, one is not liable to punishment for this unless the meat is cooked. Nevertheless, it is forbidden. See Tosafot Tractate Pesachim 24b. And we'll find in a lot of these areas that when it's a gray area, that maybe there's a leniency in the Torah, in the actual Torah prohibition, the rabbis will come in and kind of fill in the gaps, especially if it's an area where there's uncertainty as to whether or not the meat, in one community it's considered forbidden, the other community it's considered permitted. That creates all sorts of confusion. So the rabbis will come in and they'll say it's forbidden across the board, because otherwise it can cause a person to make a mistake. If a person comes from a community that raw meat is not eaten, and then he's in a community, he's visiting a community where raw meat is eaten. And if he eats raw meat from a living animal, would he be considered liable? So the rabbis just take out that possibility by saying it's forbidden everywhere. It is not the ordinary if it is not the ordinary practice to consume raw fat. Hence, one who eats raw fat taken from a living land mammal is not liable to punishment. And there might be some societies, there's marine mammals that might be considered land mammals, like walruses and that the fat might be eaten raw. And a person would have to be cautious again, what is the custom in that area? And apparently where the source is for this ruling is obviously in an area where nobody would even think, it would never enter their mind to eat raw fat. If one cooks fat and makes it into an edible liquid, one is liable. That's Tractate Pesachim 24b, Rambam Laws of Forbidden Foods, chapter 14. So here, it's like the raw meat. If the limb of the flesh from the limb of a living animal, the meat or the fat, is cooked, and now it's considered edible, that is still considered considered the living animal, and straight up it would be considered edible, and that would be a liability. One who drinks boiling fat is not liable, for this is not the common manner of consuming it, and it is not fit to be eaten in this state. Nevertheless, it is forbidden. And we're still looking at Pesachim 42b and the Rambam Laws of Forbidden Foods, chapter 14. Even though a Gentile is liable for eating the smallest amount of Abraham Makai, this applies only when it is in an edible form. So it's not considered fat would not be considered an edible form if it's either in the raw state, or in this case, it's referring to boiling. I mean, they cooked it to the point where it's boiling liquid. Grease that's in the frying pan, for example. If a person eats it while it's in that state, well, they're going to have a very sore mouth and throat, but that's not a normal way of eating, and therefore that would not be considered meat or flesh at that point. Topic number 5. Even when there is no transgression of eating Abraham Makai meat, it is still forbidden to cut off meat or limbs from any living animal to derive benefit from them. Although God granted mankind dominion over the animals, he did not grant permission to cut off their limbs and flesh. Only when a limb or meat was found already severed is it permitted to use this for some non-food purpose. So while it might be possible to use the flesh, it's not permitted to take the flesh off the animal until the animal's dead, due to the requirement of or the prohibition of cruelty to animals, which is a separate prohibition that is not It's more following the characteristics of God to be proper in this world. It's not part of the actual halakha. Now it's what's sometimes called the tom of the halakha. It's a kind of external reasoning. It's not the real reasoning. It's an external reasoning. It's learned. It's auxiliary. It's learned from the halakha, or it's associated with the halakha. Sometimes people think that the Avraham Mackay, the mitzvah, or the prohibition of Avraham Mackay, is because we should not be cruel to animals. We should be nice to animals. That's not the reason. The reason we are prohibited from Avraham Mackay is because we are prohibited from Avraham Mackay. That is the reason. And the prohibition of being cruel to animals is auxiliary. It's an outside reasoning, what's often called the tom. Tom means a taste. So the taste is an outside aspect of something. And we have to make sure that we keep the two separate from each other. So in this case, it's saying we're not permitted to cut the limb off a living animal because of we're not allowed to be cruel to animals. But once the limb is separated from the living animal, we are permitted to use it for non-food purposes. Because they're actually two separate precepts. The prohibition of Avraham Mackay and the prohibition of cruelty to animals are two entirely separate precepts. One is a clear mitzvah, and the other one is a desire to cultivate proper character traits. And we have to keep them in the proper order as to what's what. Topic number 6. One is only liable for punishment for eating meat that was taken from a living animal if, however, one cooked the meat and consumed the sauce, or squeezed out the juices from the meat and drank that, he is not liable. Kariti Upaditi, chapter 81, response of Rabbi Shner Zaman, chapter 15, Khatam Sofer Yoredeya, chapter 106. The prohibition of a permitted food, if it is absorbed in the gravy, and the prohibition of food, if it is absorbed the gravy of a forbidden food, is only a precept for Jews. So the Jews would have, they have many laws regarding absorption of taste or absorption of liquid, and that these are laws that pertain to the Jew. They do not pertain to the Gentile. For a Gentile, the prohibition is against eating the flesh, and that would not include the juice. So technically, if the person used meat from a living animal, put it in a bag, like a tea bag type of thing, a cheesecloth, and had it inside of a pot of something he's cooking, and so all the juice from the meat went into the pot of food, and then he takes the bag of flesh out. The pot of food that's been infused with this juice would be permitted halachically, but by strict Torah law. What do you mean? But by the prohibition of Avraham Mackay would not apply at this point. Similarly, if one cooked this meat together with other foods, and the forbidden meat imparted its flavor to this food, one is not liable for consuming the other foods. So that would be the case of the person with the the meat in a cheesecloth, keeps it separate, takes it out, the rest of the food is permitted. Likewise, if one sucks the juice from Abraham Mackay meat, but does not eat the meat, he is not liable. Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, no, I'm sorry, Shulchan Aruch Harav or Akaim, 320, chapter 320, topic 2, in regards to the prohibition of a Jew squeezing out juice on the Jewish Shabbat, on the Jewish Shabbat, which implies that it is not considered to be a normal method of eating. So in the Jewish there's a prohibition against squeezing juice out of something or squeezing liquid out of something. And if sucking the juice out of meat was considered eating, then it would be permitted in the case of the Shabbos law. But it's not permitted in the case of the Shabbos law, and therefore we know that sucking the juice out of the meat is not considered a form of eating. Therefore, it's not considered in the case of the limb of a living animal, the prohibition of the limb of the living animal to suck the juice out of the meat without eating the meat, without chewing the meat, without consuming the meat. It would be considered, I guess, I suppose the person is like kissing it at that point. He's sucking the liquid out. That would not be a normal form of eating, and therefore it would be permitted because the person is not eating the flesh. It is nevertheless forbidden. So all these things that are not technically, they're not a liability according to the prohibition, the Torah prohibition. It is nevertheless forbidden to deliberately cook or mix meat that was severed from a living land mammal or bird with other foods, for the purpose of then benefiting from the forbidden flesh. So I would suggest that also counts with the processed food in the earlier topic, the processed food. It would also be forbidden to if the person is expecting to use it. We're not allowed to do these things, even if they're not Torah prohibitions. It would be appropriate to forbid. So this is a strong recommendation for the court system to forbid any dish in which such Abraham Mackay meat was cooked. I assume by dish they're referring to the food inside the dish. This applies when one intentionally cooked meat taken from a living animal with other food. If, however, such meat accidentally fell into a pot and imparted its flavor into the other food, there is no reason to forbid the original food, but the forbidden piece of meat remains prohibited. See Khatam Sofer Yeridea, chapter 19. Even a food that absorbed the taste of prohibited Abraham Mackay meat is forbidden to Gentiles. But many later rabbis agree that for Gentiles, a flavor is not considered as if as if it is the meat itself. See Sadia, Kemed, Piat, Hadasha, Ma, Aritkret, Gimel, chapter 6, topic 18. So if meat accidentally became part of the dish, the meat would have to be taken out. You cannot consume the flesh, but the rest of the food would be permitted, and it's a recommended prohibition for a court not to allow it to be done on purpose. Thank you.